Thanks, everybody. So we're very happy and privileged in this bright light to welcome Douglas Wilson to Toronto. It was really, I hadn't seen the screening before. I know Cindy had, and one of the things which I really appreciated from it was this sort of the way that it described a range of different types of practices. And I wanted in a little while to sort of talk about how your practice has evolved from sort of folk games and physical-based play into sort of more digital work, just because I'm really interested by that practice. But I was curious if you could sort of talk a little bit more, because the other thing is I found is it seems quite dated now as well. And so there's a part of a challenge with the length of time it takes to make a film versus how quickly our industry is changing and evolving. And so I just wondered if you wanted to sort of reflect on changes between then and now.
Wow, really large conversation topic. Do you have about 2 hours? Or, which do you want to start with, the evolution of the practice? Or
yeah, no, I think that would be super interesting, especially given the room full of game designers.
Yeah, well, it's really different for a game like Mutazione than it is for Johann Sebastian Joust. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'll start with J.S. Joust. Yeah. But my background is actually pretty academic. So I started as a researcher at IT University of Copenhagen and did these games on the side, and then that ramped up, and then I decided to kind of do that full time after my PhD. But in Copenhagen, I, both by myself but also with other people, were making games, and I was involved in a pretty active social environment, and so kind of almost necessarily the games that we were making were very kind of local multiplayer oriented and social oriented. And there were lots of game jams and events. There's this pretty well-known game jam in Copenhagen every year called the Nordic Game Jam. I believe it's actually the biggest game jam in the world right now. And so, a lot of these games came from prototyping at these events, which is very much about kind of, it's like 2 a.m. on a Saturday night and you have 48 hours to make this game, and you're kind of sleep deprived, but having a good time and drinking beers and whatever, and trying to make each other laugh. And so there's like that kind of almost physical comedy of these games comes like a lot out of that social environment. And in my PhD, I was studying a lot of stuff about play theory and playground culture and folk games and folk studies and all sorts of stuff. And there's especially a pretty rich tradition of that kind of stuff in Scandinavia. I'm American, but I lived in Denmark for 5 years. So that was definitely a big influence. J.S. Joust specifically was influenced by a few kind of folk games or party games. And so that was really in the trajectory of that. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, no, okay. I lived in Sweden for 3 years too, so I know what you mean about the culture there. And part of the reason I wanted to point to it is I think it's really easy in game design for it to be work, not play. And I think what's interesting about J.S. Joust is it communicates play much more effectively than many games, and it speaks to the type of play that was involved in making it. And I think sometimes, when we go into Crunch or when our students go into Crunch, it's actually quite easy to lose sight of the fact that you're making a play object and that you should in some ways be playful about that process.
Well, I think, what's worked really well for me is, a lot of my most successful games were pretty quickly prototyped. So actually, J.S. Joust was prototyped at the Nordic Game Jam in 48 hours. And I kind of knew the general idea going into it, but it morphed a lot, even in those 48 hours. And, a lot of my, it's very different for a game like Mutazione, but a lot of my, for the physical game stuff, those games were already really fun and compelling after 48 hours, where, I've, over the years, forced a number of ideas that sounded really good on paper. With kind of this crew of people I was working with in Copenhagen, for example, we're working on a Wiimote game that shared similar ideas of trying to bring the action from the screen into real space. And like on paper, the idea was really good. And we were like, oh, well, let's just continue working on this. And maybe this will be really good someday. And it never quite got there. Whereas with J.S. Joust and Button, we made that drunkenly in a weekend, and it was already fun. And so now when you have to do the hard work of bringing it to console or releasing it or whatever, you're at least sitting on top of a solid base where you already know it's fun and playful, and now you're in a better position to do the boring work because you know what you're sitting on is, which is, it's really difficult when you're trying to do the hard work, but you're still searching for that fun or engagingness or whatever noun you want to use, right?
It's a hard word to design for, isn't it? That little sneaky 3-letter word.
Right, right.
But you know it when you see it. I wonder if you could just give us, I know we don't have a ton of time, if you could give us an update on the projects that you are working on. They mentioned both of them or two of the main ones in the film, the Sports Friends and Mutazone.
Yeah, there's not really much to say, unfortunately. Sports Friends is like on the verge of release, like very, very soon. But that's been just, in fact, almost all of my time since the film has been kind of the boring biz dev team management stuff. You know, like bringing a, you got a little bit of this with the Journey people, but turns out bringing a game to consoles is like not this easy, quick thing that you just do. So it's been pretty weird. I kind of went from an academic who sat in a room literally by myself and just wrote whatever papers I wanted to, kind of, you know, traveling about the business stuff and managing this team. And so, some of the team has been working actually on Mutazione on and off. Right now they're working on it slowly. I would really, really, really like to go back to that, but I've been swamped with Sports Friends. That'll pick up after Sports Friends finished. So everything is, you know, especially when you're like a really scrappy team of, and for us, remote collaborators, we don't even really work in person that much together. It's kind of very slow moving, but I think that kind of works for me as well. Like letting things really stew and evolve over time. So Mutazione will not be out anytime, even remotely soon, but that's fine, kind of okay by us at least.
So one of the things that I was really interested in when I came to Canada and coming to an arts institution was thinking about how illustration practices could inform design practices. And
how illustration?
Yeah, okay. Because I mean, one of the things at our school is we've got an amazing tradition of sort of illustration practice, and so I think we're just sort of starting to play with that. And I just wanted to know how you were working with the illustration in Mutazione.
I think it's a really cool point. You know, there's probably a longer discussion as well. I think there's this like rhetoric you often hear from game developers, which is like, kind of, you have to kind of be a programmer or whatever, and all the like to tighten the loop that the designer should be the programmer. And there's a certain truth or like advantage, but I do think that's like not the only way of going about it. And so, you know, definitely for Mutazione, it is directly kind of inspired and derived. Right? So Nils is not a programmer; he does no programming, but that's definitely the starting point and like the ending point for all the work we're doing on that game. It has beautiful visuals and to some extent the music as well. But so it turns out there's lots of different ways of thinking about games and making them. And so a really good example of this is Fez, you know, to mention a Kokoromi collaborator, which is, you know, very much, you know, again, Phil Fish, one of the designers, isn't really a programmer, but that game came very much from this visual vision he had. So while that's not the only approach, I think that is a really, you know, seeing this beautiful vision and then wanting to bring that to life. I think that's that's definitely a really valid and exciting approach as well, for sure.
Now, a lot of your other games come from this from a scene I'm really familiar with, which is this kind of independent arcade, almost game social game scene. That which is where we know each other from,
right?
I mean that's where I kind of first came in contact with the game Button. I have a great anecdote about Button, but I don't have time to tell it.
That's right. So. I know what the anecdote is.
Yes, I've told it many times. And obviously, Jost kind of comes from that too. And I mean, one thing that occurs to me when you're talking about it is just how much those games have time to marinate, but to kind of to get extensively tested and tweaked. And so I was wondering if you had any kind of, I guess, reflections back on that community or that way of coming into games.
Yeah, you know, that was really big for me, was having this community of practice, this kind of team of designers. We at the time, I was co-running this kind of collective, the Copenhagen Game Collective. And, you know, just if you're making a local multiplayer game, it's almost impossible to do it by yourself. And in fact, just for various spatial and other reasons, even though I'm in New York, which is so I moved back to New York about a year ago, very social environment in many ways, I'm not kind of as deeply enmeshed in the same kind of game jam scene, social media, partly just because I've been so busy. And like almost as a result, I've kind of pushed aside some of the physical gaming stuff for now, and kind of almost, I'm thinking about Mutazione and a lot of kind of more single player based games. So definitely for me, the social and spatial environment I'm in has like had a huge effect on that. I think for all of us in Sports Friends, though, a lot of those games came out of all of us were traveling a lot to game events, whether they were small local events or PAX or GDC or Indiecade or whatever. And again, letting those games stew over time and seeing people play them. Because if you're making a 4-player game, you need to see other groups of 4 players playing this thing. So I think for all of us traveling really aggressively and going to these events and participating in this thriving culture or set of different cultures was really key part, at least for the Sports Friends games. It's really in the DNA of all those games.
I have a really quick and kind of silly follow-up question to that, because I know that you're going to be playing, or you're going to be setting up JS Jost again at an event later on this evening called the Fancy Video Game Party,
right,
which is put on by just the Wild Rumpus from the UK. And I know often that you have themes for it, depending on different locations. And is there a theme tonight?
This is really boring. The theme is testing the near final PlayStation 3 build. Originally I had debated running I have a special installation version, which I can, kind of scale up to 18 or more players. But it's kind of a little bit too much technical setup for this weekend. So it'll be, I might throw on some, like the final build lets you put in your own music. But we'll see this one. Well, actually, I'm really excited. This isn't actually as boring as it sounds. What people haven't really seen is there's like an illustration now that accompanies the game, which is weird on the face of things because it's supposed to be no graphics game. But this is a very kind of like long discussion. But I realized that once we were going to put it in this commercial context, like it would help to have something on the screen, at least to kind of prime people to get them into the right mood and kind of hint at how the game was played. And also just as a nice kind of, even though you're not looking at the screen while you're playing, and this almost nice kind of screensaver that like consecrates the arena play or something. And so it's actually like super thrilled about how the visuals turned out. They're by this Montreal-based artist, Dom 2D, and he did a totally bang up job. I'm like over the moon about how good the visuals look. And so this will be one of not the first, but one of the first public exhibitions where we run it off the PlayStation 3 with the proper visuals, which, it's nice to have that kind of, again, that entry point into the whole thing. So yeah, actually I'm excited about that. And he's going to be there in person too. So it's cool to show that in public.
I don't know if I have time. Do I have time for one more longer question? Okay, so one of the things that I've experienced through living in lots of different countries is I'm imagining games coming from specific locations. So I think games like Sword and Sorcery are very Canadian, and so I think part of this sort of really healthy fragmentation of form, where there's lots of different processes, speaks to sort of cultural specificity in a really interesting way. And I, as a traveller, as somebody who comes from many places, I was just really curious about your observations on that and how we here can foster that type of community.
100% agree. I mean, Sports Friends is very much a New York City game. I feel, even though, I guess Bennett and I only technically just moved there within the last year, but the other two designers are from New York. There's two of the games, Barbarieball and Hokra, were commissioned by NYU. A lot of this stuff, a lot of us were inspired. And even though Bennett had been living in the UK and I had been living in Denmark, we're coming back to New York all the time for exhibitions. There's an arts game collective in New York called Baby Castles, which I think was really foundational for all our thinking for these, local multiplayer games that we're doing in Sports Friends. So, that's just one example of, I think, where New York specifically reflects itself in that game. And JS Joust definitely has, even though I'm not Danish, I think draws very heavily from that Copenhagen milieu I was part of for a while. So totally agree. And yeah, it's really fascinating. I guess for like a longer question of how to generate that. I mean, I think just putting yourself out there and finding collaborators and being involved and going to events and starting events and all of this is this kind of like catalyst for this, like starting some sort of coherent scene that does end up affecting. So, I mean, although like Toronto is almost like ground zero for this kind of stuff, right? So,
well, it's been really interesting. I've been here 4 years, and I know Cindy's done lots of work here. I think you're actually from Toronto originally, anyway, aren't you? I came into a scene which was really flourishing, and
right.
It's been a real privilege sort of witnessing how it's grown and seeing how different communities are trying to engage and support it. And so when I first came, there weren't many academics, and now all of a sudden we have quite a big, healthy academic community who are writing game studies in a number of different institutions. So it's almost like we're, as always, playing catch up with the development scene in terms of our critique. And I think as we get bigger, one of the big questions is how do our students take place in that, and how does it fragment out? Because again, it gets so big, and then there'll be sort of smaller groups.
Yeah.
So I wrestle a lot with questions of sustainability.
And
big collaboration
time.
and stuff, which I think is an ongoing.
I mean, it's good to be optimistic and positive. There's really a lot of good stuff going on, but you're totally right. As like. You even see with Steam and Greenlight or whatever, as a million people try to do this, commercially, how viable is that? And so there's definitely really kind of also deep lurking questions. But, I think in terms of at least the like raw art and creativity, there's never been a better time for this kind of stuff. And certainly Toronto is, easily one of the best places in the world for this. I think a lot of us are, jealous. I mean, less so now because other cities are now catching up and like you said, are putting their own spin on things. So how New York does it is very different than Toronto, but equally kind of valid and interesting in its own way. So I guess for all of you in the audience who are based in Toronto, at least you're kind of in a really vibrant space for that. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so perhaps we can open it up to questions from the floor now. We've got some people with microphones over here, and actually the lighting is such that I can't see very well.
You'll have to communicate solely through your voice because we can't see anything.
I think there's somebody over here.
Yeah. To Emma's second question, when you opened up the discussion, what are the broad brushstroke changes that have happened in the industry since the film was made?
Well, I think the film focuses on a lot of like polished commercial games, which definitely felt like that, at least a couple of years ago, felt like the big story where like indie games had finally broken through the rest of it. Like we're on the radar of everyone in the games industry. So, when Antichamber comes out, for example, that's no longer just some niche indie game. Like everyone in video games knew about that game, which is pretty crazy if you think about like the last 20 years of games. Well, to some extent, it's not, we can obviously point to historical precedents, but you did feel this like growing wave of like people were taking these smaller games and these smaller teams seriously. I think a lot of kind of the work and the response to that since though has also been pointing to like slightly less commercialized games coming from like a broader variety of like kind of backgrounds and like diversity, and not necessarily just these kind of really polished commercially viable games, but also just like weird game jam projects done for the sake of making it. And I don't know, I think Sarah is in the audience. She and Lee Perry co-curated this. I don't know if you attended it last night, this punk arcade, right? And so that was very much an exhibition about these games made in like 48 hours or less or whatever. And that sometimes the process is the point and not the end point. And so, it's great. And, the movie did what it did, but it was definitely focusing on one slice, which is the, kind of working to make these polished end products which is great. Like I don't even mean that skeptically or critically, but I think the last 2 years especially has seen this groundswell of like, well, hold on, that's like not that's not the only way we can think about video games. And in fact, for like political and diversity reasons, it might be important to think about game making as end itself and not just means or something. So I think that's I guess the epilogue to the film that we saw. I would say, I don't know if you guys agree with that.
Yeah, and I think that it makes this film an interesting document too, because it captures this period of time where the big story was that there were these independent games that were really indiscernible from what you would call, I guess, mainstream games.
Right.
And even through, like, even running through the film and getting to the end, I mean, you can see kind of during the epilogue, you get a film like Journey, which sweeps the GDC awards.
Right.
And there's an independent game festival, which is part of the Game Developers Conference. Then there's the, I guess, more mainstream GDC Developers Choice Awards. And it's not that it swept the independent game awards. It's that every award, they were jokingly calling it the Journey Awards for when it came out, because right. Every single one of them would go to Journey. So, and I think that since the time period shown in the film, there's really less of a division. I mean, even the name of the film, Us in the Game Industry, it's not the separation anymore between independent games and the game industry. Independent producers are part of the game industry, and it seems like now it seems like they've always been part of the game industry. But I mean, we can all remember a time where there was a very strict division between whether or not you were a mainstream game developer and whether or not you were an independent game developer, and that's gone now. That's not that doesn't seem like there's that there's that kind of division there. But then you also have, but in a way, I think that also opens up more space at the I suppose more experimental end of game development for new creators to come into the space, because there's that, I don't know, it's almost like there's a middle level of game production that's got swept up into the mainstream right. games industry now, and it's opened up this space for different sorts of experiments.
Yeah, it's interesting. A guy called Victor Turner has this notion of liminality, which is just how the edges or the periphery of activity always gets co-opted and sort of centered in some ways. And what's nice is there's always an edge now, is that while these indie games become more mainstream and more accepted and more foundational to the sort of commercial sector, there remains this edge of work and practice, which shows for me that games are old enough to question themselves. Like, it's like we're no longer engaging in are they art, or even what type of art are they. It's let's critique and push the edges of what the form stands for and what its potential is. And so I think those edges are super healthy.
I actually can add to that and geek out a little bit. I think probably the most problematic claim in the film from the people are being interviewed, which is like, the AAA games are just about shooting, but like finally, if we can make these like alternative games, we'll explore. And like, there's certainly a certain truth to that, but I think it probably locates too much importance and meaning in the object itself. And in fact, to also answer your question, if I think about the last 2 years, I think about something like awesome games done quick. I don't know if you've followed this, but it's like speed running has really taken off, especially in the age of live streaming, which to me is probably the number one most important thing that's happened since the film, is the rise of Twitch and live streaming. And so, the realization here is that, despite how whatever boring we may think AAA games are, people are playing them and subverting them in like super fascinating ways. And, I think about Cosmo doing amazing Wind Waker runs in Zelda, exploiting crazy glitches and almost like playing Zelda as performance art. And so it's not a binary of like, oh, finally we'll make these independent games and they'll be meaningful. I think it's right. The alternative answer is like, maybe we should rethink how we play existing games and organize around games. Right. And so I get that would be my pushback to some of some of my colleagues and I like everyone in the film, but again, I think the rise of Twitch and stuff is creativity doesn't just come from the making of it. It also comes from the playing of it and curating it and writing about it and stuff. So it's a messier reality, not necessarily, right? It's a messier reality than what's depicted in this 2-hour documentary or something. That's my rant. So.
Next question.
So, what new opportunities would you say that the indie industry has given to new game developers or potential game developers like us that are wanting to break into the industry eventually?
Maybe this is a weird response. I bristle like a little bit at this phrase, like breaking into the industry, or like I wonder. I think this is like
that's maybe a bit pretentious to say.
Well, I mean, like, yeah, that's true. But I think there's maybe, especially in this decade, a way of slightly rephrasing that question that points to actually kind of dynamics are in place. So, right, like I would say 10 years ago, you would go to a program and then you would try to figure out how to get hired at, an existing company or so forth. But, there are a lot of, and it's very difficult in many ways, but in some ways it's more possible than ever to kind of do your own thing and find an audience and so I think a lot of people, rather than like, I guess this is overstated a little bit, but instead of like, how do I get a job in the game industry or break into it? It's like, fuck it, how do I start my own sub industry, right? And so I think, and again, I don't want to glorify that too much. Like certainly there's like pluses and minuses of doing it everywhere, whether it's working for a big AAA company or a mid-sized company or starting your own thing. I guess I would just say it's like more than ever it seems like there's more paths and more people carving out their own weird spaces, both commercially but also artistically. I think especially the big sea change for me is that there's a lot of public events and showcases, and whether it's artistic events by people like Wild Rumpus or Kokoromi, or whether it's going to PAX and showing in the Indie Mega booth or going to IndieCade as a finalist or whatever. It's, I think, in some ways like easier to get on people's radars than it was 10 years ago, because there's also journalists and stuff who want to write about independent games, and so I think a lot of the people doing this effectively are doing that ground level work. I mean, okay, even like, so let's even if you're a student and do want to, in the traditional way, break into the game industry, I think a lot of the students doing that effectively have not just kind of like nice video reels or whatever that they can show, but have made weird little projects, whether by themselves or with teams, that they've shown and they've been around and they've kind of made a little tiny, even to a tiny extent, a little bit of a name for themselves. And that's almost, with so many people wanting to break into the industry, that's almost become like a important way of distinguishing yourselves. So I guess that's what I mean about like just like thinking a little more about the phrasing. Like I think people, and again, this is both for good and bad, but people, especially students, figuring out how to carve out that attention and reach journalists and fans and so forth. It's a little bit of a long answer.
I think that when you're a student, it's often easy to get sort of bound up in the framing of the degree you're in or the education you're in, and not to think about that time that you have as being pretty precious. I know you're paying for it, right? But actually, that's the freest time you're ever going to have if you're going to go into traditional industry in terms of making your own games, things that you're in, developing your own expressive voice, like pulling together sort of hybrid skill sets that let you experiment with the form, which is something that the industry, whether it's the cultural industry of indie games and DIY games, or whether it's the more mainstream industry, are interested in that type of exploration. So I'd say it's always a case of using your time well and taking all of the opportunities that are around you locally and more widely to get your work out there and to get talking to as many different interesting game makers as you can find.
I guess just to rephrase it really quickly, right? I guess the thing is the industry isn't a stable thing. And like in the kind of extreme case, just look at the guy who made Flappy Bird is somewhat, outsider who lived in Vietnam who suddenly like literally changed video game history kind of in a way. So it's, once you kind of realize that the video game industry is this kind of ever-changing beast and like learn to make that work for you, which is a kind of vague and thing to say, but I think you can be like a little bit more proactive in terms of carving out your own niche, I guess is what I was trying to say.
One question here. Could we get a mic down to? No, I think you need a mic. No, it's. I think
it's because it goes into the recording system.
Sorry. So you talked a little bit about how different countries you get slightly different game input, but how do you think that, we talk about North America and we talk about a little bit of Copenhagen and Denmark and places like that, but I'm from Israel and it's basically, 2.5 people who make games and it's growing, but how is this international and the ability now to live wherever and affect the industry, would it really change stuff in the industry?
Yeah, good question. I guess it's the hope, right? I mean, it is still very North America dominated. I felt pressures to move back to North America, so that's real. But especially Europe, Japan, North America. There are I think there's a few. Beeping somewhere.
I think I'm about to explode.
If you, I can think of a few really talented indie designers in Argentina and South Africa. So it's even Brazil. So it's the wheels are turning a little bit, but I think it's also up to us to kind of help ferment that. And I guess I would say people in these places or communities that aren't quite as on the map as like a Toronto or a San Francisco or whatever, just starting it from the ground up and doing meetups and finding like-minded people. And also, obviously it's expensive to travel, but as much as possible, going to other communities and seeing how other people are doing it. And that like even for us in Denmark, I think, for example, Coke Romy and the kind of the work that we saw being done in Canada was kind of like an inspiration point, which was like, well, why can't we do that as well? And so, but yeah, no, I agree with you. It'd be great to see a kind of a broader diversity of communities out there.
I have a bit of a plan in that in the old days of television, interesting projects were funded through this funding triad of like Scandinavia, Canada, Australia. All the non-dominant markets got together and offered a very progressive funding situation. And I think that games can exploit that too. So I think we can think about more generous environments, funding contexts, and thinking about how they can reach out into different communities. So, I think some of the work in Canada is a direct or not so direct result from the funding environment that's here. Yep. And so thinking about, how Australia is looking at a similar funding environment to try and introduce sort of indie games to that community. So thinking about how you pull independent funds together for this type of experimentation and making that happen, I think we need to get to more different types of communities that way. So that's one of the answers, I think.
And I mean, to a certain extent, like local communities are wonderful, like having like different environments where people get together and they build their own scene and they build their own sorts of games. I mean, they have a great. You don't want to have this uniform vision of like everybody having the same references and everybody talking about and playing the same games. It's just that piece then, and again, it's mostly is because I think of travel and just being able to network and have a good community of people. Where you at some point get out of that really tight-knit, focused in local environment, and can find out that there's people who are doing really interesting games in this culture, or games are being viewed entirely different in this culture, and it's that we need to get a little bit better at doing. But
and I think we might have room for one last question.
Hi. I was just wondering because I noticed there was a really peculiar statement that I think it was you made in the movie that I really did agree with, where you talked about people who were saying that this so-and-so is not a game. I myself am working on a very experimental game for my new media thesis at Ryerson University, and I've had several people tell me that this is not a game. This is not a game outright, and I've had a lot of controversy over that. And that, to me, that just tells me I'm doing something right. But I was wondering, just like when you hear a lot of that, like what do you really think about people's reactions to it?
Wow, yeah, big topic. Yeah, I've also really kind of frustrated by. I mean, a lot of us, I guess, are. Especially when I thought really beautiful games like Proteus and Dear Esther came out that they had something to prove or something in order to kind of earn that like mainstream coverage or something. I guess for me, this is like kind of a longer discussion. The term game is not like a formal definition. It's almost more about like who you're hanging out with and then where you. It's defined by social context. So the fact JS Joust is a video game to me, even though it doesn't have video, because I'm hanging out with other video game developers. The same way I would say what's important probably for you is what audience are you trying to reach? What community of practitioners are you trying to reach, right? Because it's very different if you want to like be in the new media art world versus the video game world. And a lot of that isn't just in the object itself, but how you're trying to position yourself, what kind of communities you're trying to reach. And you're right, to some extent, it is a sign that maybe you are flirting with that edge of what kind of existing conventions are, which can be, one, really difficult and frustrating, but on the other hand, can be really exciting. And, especially, Dear Esther, for example, sold like crazy on Steam. So somehow they made that controversy almost work for that. Gone Home is another really good example of this. So I think it's a risky but exciting proposition where at worst you're kind of marginalized and ignored by this community who isn't kind of seeing this product you made as relevant to them, but at best becomes a really useful provocation. So it's a dangerous line, but it's a really important line. And I think it's good that some people are trying to like make those provocations. So, but in the end, I guess it's just how do you find a group of people, both players and other developers, who are like vibing with what you're doing, and whether that's I think that's the most important thing. Whether that ends up being video games or new media art or film or like whatever it is, like I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you.
So I guess just to wrap up.
Oh, actually, can I make one just quick? Just because if I don't mention it, it's going to bug me forever. So there's actually a slight correction I want to make for the film. The film has many lovely moments in it, but there's one thing that continually just kind of got me, and I have been thinking about it since it came up. So there's a game in the film that's shown called Mule, and the creator of that game is Danny Button-Berry. And so it was just a miscredit in the film. She's an extraordinarily well-respected early game designer, and I wanted to make sure that she was credited properly on it. So it's not clap-worthy. It's just
unfortunately passed away, though, right?
Yeah, she was.
Right.
And again, I'm really thrilled that we were able to put together this sort of showcase thanks to sort of Cindy's effort and time. And one of the things, just speaking from sort of OCAD's point of view, is hopefully this is the first of many collaborations between OCAD and Sheridan, because I think there's a whole bunch of really interesting game things happening now between our institutions, and it'd be good to keep on collaborating effectively. So thanks very much. Thanks, Tiff. Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Douglas.
Thank you.